This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Aproveitando o break do seu podcast para perguntar: será que você sabe?
Quem é ele? Esse tal de rock and roll.
Trident apresenta um feat de gerações com Rita Lee e Luísa Sonza.
Eu procuro estar por dentro, doutor, dessa nova geração. Mas minha filha não me leva a sério, doutor. Ela fica cheia de mistério com esse tal de rock and roll.
Quando terminar seu podcast, já aproveita para ouvir esse feat aqui no Spotify. Trident no Rock in Rio 40 anos. Masca e destrava seu rock and roll.
Welcome to Japan on Film Podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine, and I'm welcoming a new guest today, and that is Jamie Ryder. Jamie, how you doing today?
Yeah, really good, thanks. Pretty early in the morning where I'm from, but waking up to talking about Japanese films is always exciting for me. So yeah, let's see where the conversation goes, and I'm sure we'll get quite deep down the rabbit hole and veer off in a few different directions, because I think that is the beauty of Japanese cinema to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, absolutely, that's well said, and thank you for getting up early. It's about 3 o'clock here in Japan where I'm at, but I know you guys over in the UK. It's always difficult to find times that are complementary between Japan and the UK, unfortunately. But before we get started too much about the movie, why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm based in Manchester in the UK, and Japanese culture has been fascinating for me since I was a kid. Always started, I think, back in the 90s with like anime, with things like Pokemon and Dragon Ball Z. I think that is how a lot of people of my generation particularly got into it, through this really well crafted the animated stories, and then it just like dovetailed from there. Particularly in the UK, there's always seemed to be this fascination with Japanese culture in various formats, particularly with the food and drink. And I remember just like being super interested in the history, like with the samurai and like all the geishas and all like those really romantic images of the country. And as I grew older, I wanted to learn more about it, and that eventually led me to watch a bunch of movies, but also to create my own magazine called Yamato. I started writing that back in 2019 because I wanted to help bring more awareness to the culture in the UK, but also to do it on a worldwide level. And then that led me to actually get really into like Japanese drinks and food. So I took a couple of like sake sommelier courses, and I now like to educate people about it in the UK, whether it is through cinema or through different pop culture mediums as well, because I do think pop culture is the greatest like gateway into learning about cultures that we don't really know much about, and seeing how they transcend what they do and how we can find our own interpretations in them too.
Well, it's really well said, and I think you're right too. I definitely agree with that as well. And with Japan especially, I think the way that I think their pop culture has been one of the big ways that they've managed to go from being maybe not mostly despised nation at the end of World War II, within and over the span of like 50 years, they went from that to becoming like one of the most well-liked nations, I guess, at least in terms of like visas and stuff like that. The Japanese passport is said to be like one of the most powerful ones in the world. You have like visa-free entry in more countries than almost any other passport. And a big part of that is, I think, because of Japan has done a really good job of exporting its own pop culture through like you said, anime, but movies, music, video games, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, for sure. And I do really think it's like, because part of my background is like marketing as well, but I really find it fascinating how, Japan has essentially sort of rebranded itself, as you rightly said, from that, post World War II defeat, and now it's become like a booming, like animation-led, movie-led like franchise where people just have so many things to look into, and it's really helped the tourism side as well, but also it's really helped to tell different stories about the place too.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about your magazine and what you're doing now with Japanese other types of Japanese culture. So talk a little bit about How long were you doing Yamato Magazine, and are you still doing it, or is that gone now?
Yes, so I'm balancing it still. So originally it began in 2019, like I said, just to help me learn more about the culture through various formats. That led me down like the sake rabbit hole, but that eventually culminated in me writing a book called Japanese Fighting Heroes, which is actually out in the UK next week on February 28th, and it is also out in the States and Japan on April 18th. But really, that just all blended together well in this idea of, there's loads of like larger than life figures in Japanese culture, but there's also like a lot of like myths around that. So where does the romance begin, but where is also the reality of it? So I got really deep down the rabbit hole with that. Here it is here. So Japanese fighting heroes, warriors, samurai and Ronin. It's looking into the samurai like Miyamoto Musashi, Date Masamune, why we look at these samurai as like these really larger than life figures, but also where did all this get started? But also not just like the actual traditional Japanese fighters. We have people like creative rebels like Ryunosuke Akutagawa, the famous short story writer, Ono no Komachi, one of the most famous poets of all time in Japan, and also Akira Kurosawa, probably the greatest Japanese director in Western pop culture, at least, and a lot of what we know about it. So,
Mhm.
again, that led into my interest in movies and how, the book starts from looking all the way back into the ancient past and then going all the way up to how Kurosawa put all of this into a modern audience, and then how we can still learn about these figures day to day, or maybe not learn from them, like what made them flawed at the end of the day, because
Mhm.
that is what reality and romance is about. It's separating them, but also seeing how they coalesced at the same time.
Okay. Very cool. And so we're recording this in February, but by the time people listen to this podcast, it'll probably be in the summer when we're releasing. So the book should be out by now. So guys, you can definitely go check that out. We'll definitely have a link to it in the show notes below. Um, and how's the reception been for Yamato Magazine?
It's been really interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think the what's the way to say this? I think the way with any creative endeavor is you just really start it for yourself, don't you, at the end of the day, and you don't really
Hmm.
think about how it's going to be received. I think you just start by doing it for yourself, and that is where I initially came from. But
Hmm.
from the content that I put out there, like in various different aspects, it's been really interesting to see the feedback, and it's also propelled me to want to learn more, because that is how I started to do like, sake tastings professionally, that kind of
Hmm.
thing. How people have come back to me and said, "Oh, that's like really interesting. You've opened my eyes to something that I might never have looked at before." So that is very gratifying to me in any creative endeavor.
And is it an online magazine, or is it also in print as well?
It's currently online, and you can find that at yamatomagazine.blog, and there's a lot of different content around food and drink and the history that I've already mentioned.
Okay, cool, cool. And you said you got in through anime and that kind of stuff. So like, and most people, they get introduced to Japanese culture through anime and stuff like that. But usually they tend to like maybe they'll stay in that lane, or maybe they'll just veer only slightly outside of it. But you seem to have gone like, really broad and like really gotten into stuff. Um, what was it that made you want to seek out more stuff in about Japan? Was there something in like some anime you had seen, or was it just like, oh well, I ran out of anime, so let me try some movies, or what was it that kind of made you want to branch out even more and expand as much as you have?
Well, I think it just really comes back to just genuine curiosity, really, because,
Mhm.
I think because mostly what I identify as is like a like a fiction writer, really. So I've always liked storytelling in different formats, and I just thought like as interesting as the anime storytelling format is, there's probably like loads of other different storytelling mediums that you can look at through that Japanese lens, and that did lead me to more like historical movies like Kurosawa's work, but then also
Mhm.
branching out into, short fiction, more non-fiction work as well. But I think it's really interesting to me how like all different Japanese storytelling methods seem to come back to like specific themes around like folk heroes, but also just very interesting characteristics that I put down into the book as well, and trying to identify what the culture looks for in these cultural heroes or these big like cultural myths and how they get reinterpreted into the Western lens.
Mhm. Okay, cool. And you mentioned that you identify as a fiction writer too. So do you have any fiction published, or are you planning to get any published?
Yeah, so it's been varied through the years. I've published like a short story collection just to experiment in that medium. I do tend to wear like quite a few creative hats, but something that I do like as well is like video games. So I am currently working on a world that I like to think of as a blend of Red Dead Redemption meets The Witcher. I'm looking to create like a wider world out of it, like a horror western setting, and set some novels and novellas there later down the line. And that's something that I do in my spare time when I'm writing about like history, but also in my day-to-day marketing jobs too.
Okay, very cool. So do you have any sort of time frame on when you're planning to put that stuff out yet, or not yet?
No, to be determined. I'm still in the case of like promoting this book at the moment.
Okay, cool. And how's the promotion been going on so far on Japanese fighting heroes?
Well, we're just gearing up, so it's
Okay.
too early to say at the moment. So this is great to see where the conversations go, and I'm really looking forward to just trying to educate people in various formats with the book.
Okay, cool, cool. So while we're just on the subject of the book, is there anything else you want to say about it before we move into the jump into the movie discussion?
Yeah, sure. So I would say this. I think there sometimes might be a tendency when people look at Japan to think, oh, do I have to know a lot about it to like, get into it? And I
Hmm.
really believe that you don't. You can look at it from really the casual person who just wants to travel there and just embrace a new culture, or you might be a super fan who knows like all the history and want to get really geeky with certain aspects of it. And I think that's great too. I very much wrote the book to be a gateway for people of all like various aspects of who want to look at Japan, whether you are that casual traveler or you're trying to look at it from like a philosophical angle and just want to like build up new mental health techniques. So I would encourage you just to broaden your horizons with any culture and just see what you think of the book. And if you take something away from it, then that's great.
Yeah, yeah. That's great advice, and that's something I try to strive to do here on this show as well. Try and bring on guests who, um, we've had guests who do have a lot of knowledge of Japan, Japanese culture, Japanese film, like you obviously do. We've had some other ones too, like professors of Japanese film and all that kind of stuff. But we've also had people on who are just like, I just like this movie, and so that's been fun too to bring that perspective too, where they're coming at it from the perspective that maybe most people who listen to this show would have, and whereas then I come from a more perspective of having a little bit more firsthand knowledge with it, with my experiences here. So yeah, and I agree with you. Like it's not that kind of thing where you have to know a lot about it. The more you learn, the richer the experience becomes. But with most of the stuff, you can just kind of like dive in and see what you like about it.
Absolutely. And I think the movie that we're going to talk about is definitely a great gateway to look at a very broad spectrum of Japanese culture.
Right. Yeah. And so that's a good way to segue into this. So today we are talking about Drunken Angel, or酔いどれ天使, 1948 film directed by Akira Kurosawa, and featuring, two of his notable recurring actors. We have Takashi Shimura and Toshiro Mifune both in this. And this was the first time, I believe, first time that Mifune and Kurosawa worked together, which would then obviously start a very long career partnership between the two of them. Um, and it's an interesting movie to go back and look at, because this was actually my first time watching it, but I've heard of it before, and I think I'm pretty sure, I'm not 100%, but I'm pretty sure that this is the earliest of Kurosawa's films that I've seen to date. But before we talk too much about my impressions of watching it, why don't we talk a little bit about you? Because you said this was your second time watching it. So, when was the first time you saw this movie?
So similar to you, I'd heard of like a lot of different kinds of Kurosawa's work, but Drunken Angel was actually something that I came to when I was actually doing research for the book, because I do have a chapter 100% dedicated to Kurosawa's life, and I've really wanted to deep dive into his oeuvre and see how he started to where he got in his later career. And Drunken Angel kept coming up a lot in my research just based on the story. And I thought, right, I want to like, get do do his work justice. So I spent a lot of time just looking at a lot of his films and watching them, getting my impressions. But I think of like all of the films that I watched, Drunken Angel was very much one of my top three favorites, just in terms of the subject matter, the way it was acted, and obviously that historic like movie partnership between Mifune and Kurosawa as well, because I believe that was when Kurosawa first discovered Mifune and really went to bat for him to get this role, which I find like really interesting too. But then obviously when we were doing this podcast, I wanted to go back to it again just to see if I'd missed something and there had been like little details that I can appreciate more a second time around, because I was just watching it, casually the first time. But I think it's great to do like a second look through it and get really deep into the weeds now that you can see more like Kurosawa's like particular way that he directs and all the themes that he's going for too.
Yeah. So this is my first time watching it. So definitely, if you pick up on anything anything you picked up, I definitely want to hear about that. But one of the things that struck me about this is first off how this movie has a lot of themes that Kurosawa would revisit in later works, right? The whole idea of the kind of like, gruff, like rough edge doctor type of thing, right? He would later come to do that in Redbeard. But even this kind of like, the kind of like almost social consciousness aspect of it, that's something that we revisited a lot, particularly in Ikidu, which also starred Shimoda. So that was kind of those were kind of the first things that jumped out at me. And I also do want to talk about the setting too, because this was made and released at a point where Japan was still under American occupation. He had actually faced some censorship challenges, and he was able to get some stuff in under the notice of the censors, which I think is pretty clever of him. But what are some things that stuck out for you?
Yeah, great question. I mean, first the setting, like what I found really interesting about researching this film in particular is when Kurosawa was coming up with the film himself, I believe he was like just convalescing with like a writing partner, like a hot springs in Japan. And he saw this like down freighter just outside of his window in this hot springs town. And to him, that was like the metaphorical defeat of Japan in that post-war setting. So that sent him down the rabbit hole to start writing this film. And to actually have that background knowledge, I think it's such a powerful image, because the way the camera's always like panned back to like that big vista of like the swamp and everything is like in a state of decay. That really like is like a metaphor, I think, for like that post World War II Japan where everything is broken and they're trying to rebuild, and like there's a lot of corruption and darkness going on in that setting with like the Yakuza and that like grey area that these characters operate in too. So that's a big like selling point, at least for me, when I think about this film.
Yeah, that came up as well. The way he keeps referring back to like the like swamp like bog of it, and some of the things he did was because during that time, they wouldn't allow. I'm not sure how much research you've done into the occupation era of Japan. Have you done a whole lot of research in that period of history?
I know a few things, but it'd be great to hear your opinion on it. Yeah.
Well, so I will recommend, there is a great book on this called Embracing Defeat by John Dower. It's wonderfully detailed, goes in depth into the occupation period, and it's a thick book. Like you could probably beat somebody to death with the thing, but it is but despite that, it is an engaging read. Like it's like 500, 600 some pages, but you breeze through it because it's just very well written. And one of the interesting things is that directors who were operating in both the wartime period, the pre-war period, and also the post-war period, they were being kind of batted around a lot, because Kurosawa started working. I believe he started working before the war started, is when he started working in film, and then I think his first director credits happened during the war, if I'm not mistaken, or early on. And then obviously then he shifted to the post-war occupations. But it's funny because during the war, you could have, you had very heavy censorship from the imperial government, where it was like, you can't have any criticism of Japan, you can't have any criticism of the empire, but you can criticize the Americans all you want, right? We encourage criticism of the Americans. And then during the American occupation, it's like the opposite, right? You can criticize the empire all you want, but you can't say anything bad about the American occupation. So you had these both had this, flipping back and forth. And there were some things in there, like, they wouldn't be allowed to show like English language signs in the movie. So but to kind of show that the influence of the post-war period, right? Obviously you've got the swamp thing, like you mentioned. And he had this burned out building in the black market slum set that he wanted to use, but the censors wouldn't allow it because they felt like that was too negative of an image. But then he had stuff like, the gangsters are all, and their girlfriends, they're all dressed in Western clothing. You have the pon girls, the street prostitutes who mostly, if not exclusively, catered to the American soldiers. Even like the nightclub stuff, these were Japanese compositions, but they were satirical of jazz music at the time too.
Yeah, I mean that is something that I found like really interesting as well, and like a very underrated part of like his directing ability, I think. And it's great that you brought up the idea that he was getting battered around a lot, as a lot of those directors were, because I believe that was when really his shackles were finally taken off him when he got to put Drunken Angel out there in 1948, and you can see like how much fun he's having with the actors, and he's just free to explore the creativity that he wanted to do. And I think Mifune was a really great like vessel for him to look at that through the eyes of that gangster in particular.
Yeah, Mifune is such an interesting feature in this movie, because, to be honest, like, I knew it was Mifune, but he looks so different from like the common image everybody has of him. So when I was watching him in this movie, like, there are several times when I'm like tilting my head, I'm squinting, I'm like, is that really him? And I'm like double checking the credits list on IMDb to just double check. Yeah, that is him, isn't it? Because he looks so different from what I usually picture of when I think of Mifune.
Yeah, because I think, looking back at that time, that was his first like major role. He's very like sort of, how would I describe it? He's very like very understated, but also very explosive as well. And you see like the first instances of when he takes on the roles of all those famous samurai characters that he eventually does. And then that's how I believe we tend to know more about him, or really picture him in the popular imagination through that Seven Samurai or that Yojimbo like role too.
Yeah, absolutely. And just like the feature of this doctor, who's played by Shimura, Sanada is the character's name, and just like the 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 constraints, like, he's putting the situation that he finds himself in, right? Because he's, bit of a hypocritical edge to him, right? Where he's this guy who's always talking about how, you need to take care of better care of yourself. You need to, and meantime, he's like, drunk as a skunk for most of the film.
Yeah, for sure. And I really love the Doctor character. I think partly because, he's always speaking his mind. And I think that was a very bold choice when you pair, the traditional like Japanese image of being very polite and very, society led, where he will just speak his mind and he doesn't really care who he offends or whose skin he gets under, really. And I think that is partly because of his background. But interestingly, again, in the research of this, when Kurosawa was trying to come up with this character, they originally wanted to do like a very idealistic, like young doctor who like was quite stereotypical, but he and his writing partner went down to Yokohama and actually found like quite a shifty looking doctor who was operating without a license. And then that became the inspiration for the Sonata character. And I think that works so much better as, a doctor that is quite like shades of grey like anyways. So he can operate as like a dark mirror of this Yakuza character, and how you see this very uneasy friendship develop as we go along. But obviously there is a lot of tension and back and forth with like a father and son relationship, and like a like a very older brother, younger brother relationship, I think that you can pick apart.
Yeah, and it's funny. There are a few things I want to pick up in that, but I also want to mention too that about the fact that Shimoda is playing this character too, because just like with Kurosawa, how this is kind of a different image from what we usually picture him. He's very clean cut in this. He's very his hair's cut short. It's very neatly kept. Whereas Shimoda, right, in most of these movies, not only in Kurosawa's movies, but in other movies, like in the first Godzilla movie, much more of a he is much more of that like stereotype type that you would mention, right? He is this kind of like, this kindly figure with the big heart and, very kind of wise. And in this, I think he feels much more like if you describe this character on paper and you told me that, you described this character on paper and you told me that Toshiro Mifune is in this movie, my first thought would be, oh yeah, Mifune must be that doctor character then, because this seems like a kind of part that he usually plays, whereas this doesn't seem like the part that Shimoda usually plays, and yet he fits into it very well.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think, well, I think of the two, I think Sonata has all the best lines, really. There's like so
Mhm.
many great quotes that just come to mind. Like one off the top of my head is like, "Oh, doctors can't survive without patients, but all we do is try to cure them." And I just think that's so ridiculous, but so true at the same time. And then you really see like Kurosawa's like humanist perspective coming out there with, how he does all these really clever societal commentaries, as we've already mentioned.
And I obviously the character wasn't inspired by him because he wouldn't have been either old enough or even well known enough at that time. But I feel there's a lot when I think of someone like Hayao Miyazaki. I think there's a lot of similarities that in that I see in him that I also see in Sonata's character, where he's kind of like, I guess the best way to describe him is kind of like a hopeful cynic or a cynical optimist or something along those lines, where or like maybe a cynical humanist might be the best way to describe him.
Yeah, that I'd probably say that's quite accurate. Yeah, because I'm quite a philosophy nerd as well, but I think you can like cherry pick from different wisdom traditions, and you can just see how people might believe something, but also blend it with another worldview as well. And I think Kurosawa's always been great at like controlling it on camera, but also really like creating these really complex characters that you can picture in any setting. Really, it doesn't have to just
Mhm.
be in front of a camera.
Yeah, and I feel like, Mifune was probably taking notes when he ended up playing a similar character in Redbeard from Shimoda's performance here, because there's a definite continuity between those two characters.
Yeah, and then obviously that is the full circle moment because obviously
Mhm.
Beard was the last one they ever did together.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Um, and also this was it's kind of unique for a Yakuza film at the time because back in this period, the Yakuza, when they were depicted on film, it was, if my understanding is correct, and it very well could be wrong, but my understanding is that most of the early Yakuza films, they were kind of like the early American gangster films from like the 1930s and the 1940s, where they depict, the gangsters in a bit more like, maybe a bit more, honorable in a sense, or like a bit more, like heroic. You didn't really kind of get into like the more the dark side of things until you get to like Coppola and all that kind of thing. And same thing with most Japanese films, like you didn't really get any sort of like movies that were very critical of the Yakuza until you get to like Battles Without Honor and Humanity. But most of the early stuff there's this whole idea, and in fact it's even in it in an ironic way, and it's even shown in the American film The Yakuza that Sidney Pollack directed, where it has that. I'm not sure if you've ever seen the movie, but there's this opening title credit, and it says like uh, I can't remember the exact wording, but it was basically saying like hundreds of years ago they were called samurai, but today they're called the Yakuza, and it's like no, they weren't. But that's the kind of myth making that the Yakuza love to say about themselves. But this movie depicts Yakuza as untrustworthy, unhonorable scumbags, basically.
Yeah, and that you put up like I think that's quite a succinct way to put that, like particularly how you can compare like the Italian gangster films of the American cultures and seeing how that weaved in with that Yakuza myth as well. I mean, it's really in the film itself. There's a line from Sanada again that's like the Yakuza power is nothing but a myth, and it is absolutely is the myth that they created for themselves through the pop culture mediums that they were able to control when they got even more involved in it. But I really love that about Drunken Angel, how they never tried to shy away from that violence and that gritty, raw depiction of, these guys are not people that you want to emulate. And Sonata's like, rationality is the only approach to life. And it's the whole point of there is only one way out of this life, but also Mifune's character does seem to be like self-aware of that at the same time. He's human and you can see the complexity there, but there's only one way that you're going to go out. And obviously it does end in tragedy in the end.
Yeah, and I think this is also, and the whole thing about the doctor portion of it, how he is this kind of, he's this struggling doctor, and comparing it to that real life doctor and that they drew inspiration from. It really kind of shows the failings of the occupation to do what it had said, what it had promised it would do. And again, if you go back to Embracing Defeat, you see that in when he talks about the black market and how that was how people basically survived back then. And people would turn to things like, these back alley doctors or to the Yakuza because that was the only way they could get what they needed. And you really see those failures, illustrated in a bit of a subtle way to get past the censors in this movie.
For sure. And I'm just curious to know, is there any particular scenes like isolated that stood out for you? Because I would like to talk about the fight between Matsunaga, Mifune's character, and Okada, the gangster film at the end. I'm kind of in two minds about that because in one point I think it's quite metaphorical and it's great, but I also think it was a little bit hokey as well in some parts. And I think it's great that he managed to get like that outcome that they wanted to with, the death of this character that is trying to, for a moment, maybe there's another way out for him, but he just gets thrown back into this very violent world that he was always destined to be part of.
I mean, like I could be reaching here, but one of the things that always struck me about the American occupation and post-war Japan is how quickly the SCAP, Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers, GHQ, how quickly they did basically a whole 180 on Japanese war war criminals, because you had the Class A and the Class B war criminals, who had gone to trial, and then you had the lower ones, and some of them were Class B. I think most of them were Class C though, and because after the war, they had released all the political prisoners from who were in prison during the imperial government, and basically this is everyone who would have been put in prison for opposing the empire, and this included a lot of people like union organizers and socialists and communists and anarchists and progressives, and all these people had been put into prison for going against the empire. And then so they basically done a whole little switch where they let all those guys out and they put all the imperialists in prison. And then when they start setting up the new Japanese government, obviously these former political prisoners, their whole thing was organizing and demonstrating for change. So they're moving into the government positions, trying to change things. And then you've got like the American government and the CIA, or the precursor to the CIA at that point. I'm not sure exactly how the timeline works on that, but getting kind of spooked and getting kind of Red Scare is seeping in. So then they're like, okay, well, let's go to the Class C war criminals, and the Class C war criminals are like, hey, we'll play ball with you. We may be fascist, but we'll play ball with you. Better to ally yourself better for capitalists and fascists to ally together than for capitalists to put up with socialists and communists. So that's basically what happened. And then you had, and also the Yakuza funded them too, with the aid of the CIA and all this kind of stuff. And even to this day, those ramifications are felt. Like the Liberal Democratic Party, which I joke is neither liberal nor democratic, was founded by Nobusuke Kishi, who was, a brutal fascist governor of Manchuria, and his grandson was Shinzo Abe, the prime minister who was assassinated about a year or two back. And I think and I'm not sure how much of this was public knowledge at the time. So that this is also where I'm thinking like this might be kind of a stretch. This might just be me reading into things. But you have Okada, who is basically the symbol of the, the corrupt, evil Yakuza type. And he gets out of prison. He's basically pretty much untouchable, it seems. He controls like everything in this neighborhood. And he's the one who ends up killing Matsunaga. And and Matsunaga, right, not the best guy, but there was at least some good in him. There was a sense of redemption about him. And so it's almost kind of like, you could see that as a metaphor of like, the authority figures basically killing the chance for Japan to truly redeem itself.
Yeah, and that is a great viewpoint. Actually, I had not really thought of it through that lens, but I think Kurosawa, I would not really put that past him in terms of like his humanist perspective, and that really reminds me of that scene where I think that really becomes apparent because what I also like is the fact that I think it might be 3 or 4 times where Matsunaga continues to like go to the market, pick up a flower, and like just look out into the swamp, and then you see it for the last time, and then you see like the shadow of like a Okada behind him, and it's like, oh, this is where his fate is sealed now. Like this version of Japan is being replaced by this other version of Japan that's coming in. Then you get like all of the commentary that comes along with that too.
Yeah. And I think that you also have the Sonata character is also kind of representative of these people who had been through all this, like, a lot of maybe normal people at that time, normal adults at that time who had, you know, been lied to all throughout the war. And then they had, the lie forcefully pulled away from them. And they were just, exposed to this brutal reality of what the truth was. Even before that, the lie was kind of wearing thin. It was, oh God, I can't believe I'm blanking on his name, but he directed Battles Without Honor and Humanity and Battle Royale. And he had talked about how when he was during the war, he was a teenager and he was working in munitions factory. And he said that his experiences working in the munitions factory, and then when he saw what had happened afterwards and saw like how the government had lied to him, that it basically taught him at that time, he's like, never trust adults. So the lesson he had learned from that. And I think you see a lot of in Sonata. I think you see this. I think that's reflected in Sonata, the fact that he is someone who has been through all this. He has seen like the worst things possible, and it's affecting him. Obviously, I think that's why he is such an alcoholic. Um, and and he wants to have faith that something can be better, but it's hard for him to do that. And I think that's why ultimately he remains pretty pessimistic through all that. Like it breaks him down in a lot of ways. But then you do have the young patient, right? The teenage girl who's like 17, who ends up surviving her disease. She ends up she ends up being cured of tuberculosis by the end, and she graduates high school. And throughout it all, she maintains this, very, bright and chipper attitude. And like, in the first scene we see her, you can see like Shimura does very subtle acting when he's in that scene, but it's just like these subtle movements with his face that shows just like how charmed he is by her, how inspired he is by her optimism, right? Because because he says, like, you're a good patient, but you got to stick with the treatment and all that. And she's just like relentlessly optimistic, and almost to a cliche in some ways. But she's like, when let's bet a candy on it. Let's bet a candy that I'll beat this. And at the end, she ends up beating it. And he even says to Matsunaga, right, that girl's got more guts than you do. So I think there's something to that. Like the only hope here for the future is for the youth to stay optimistic, basically.
Yeah, for sure. I was going to mention that as well. I mean, I think that is just such a Kurosawa calling card again, how you see it develop through his other films, because that same like cycle of being a very bleak setting, but you get like a lot of hope towards the end is just like reminiscent of Rashomon as well, another of my favorite films. The original of, Ryunosuke Akutagawa's was much bleaker, but obviously Kurosawa wanted to blend that in with Inner Grove as well and have all of that darkness go on. But by the end, the rain stops, everything comes out, it's bright, and then the characters find hope again. And I think there is like a shot of going back to Drunken Angel as well. The sky seems to brighten, the music becomes like more uplifting as well as Sanada finds hope in that girl as well. And then there is hope for the rest of Japan as it develops in the outcome. And I think the women in general are very interesting in this film as well. And I don't know in terms of like how Kurosawa put this forward in other certain films, but I think within that, even that very confined world of the Yakuza, I think the women tend to have like quite a bit of like a voice, like, or at least they've got a bit of agency up to a point in the films or the scenes that they're in.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting too, where it seems like some of his earlier films, it almost feels like there's a bit more care put towards female characters than you see in some of his later films. Because I commented about that in Redbeard, that I wasn't very keen on the treatment of the female characters in that, but in this, I think there is, again, the driving force of hope in this movie is basically that schoolgirl character. But then you have the barmaid who, she's she had feelings for Matsunaga, and then she says how she had tried to get him to leave with her, to go back to the countryside, to come to the countryside with her where she grew up. And she says that, she's going to take his ashes and she's going to take them back to the countryside. So I think there's also that aspect of it too, where maybe the hope is not in these cities where all this, corruption had happened, but maybe it is back, in the heartlands.
Yeah, and that reminds me of this really lovely Japanese concept called furusato as well, which translates to home. And I think that idea of like hometown and how the home can mean so many different things in like the Japanese language is really interesting too. Home, the Yakuza might be that really corrupt port where that setting is, but home really in that traditional Japanese mindset, particularly I think in that period between like the Meiji era up to the modernization through the post-World War II world as well, was the fact that the Japanese might have lost that original idea of Furusato, where it was tied to the country, to this really rural state of living. But then as the towns got bigger, the cities got more packed out, there was like this existential crisis going on as well. And I think Drunken Angel is a really great expression of that Furusato ideal as well.
Yeah, and it's kind of tragic to see how things had shaken out that way, because you do still have that where these small towns in Japan are becoming depopulated, because so much in Japan is centralized in these big city centers like Tokyo and Osaka. So, but also I think there is, and I think about it, comparing it to, like, I'm not sure, maybe you can comment on this from a UK perspective as well, but talking about it from an American perspective, I don't think most Americans have the same kind of attachment to their hometowns nowadays that you see in Japan. Like, I think there is, like, I see this with people all the time. Like, you talk to people about, where they're from, you talk to them about their homeland, and when they talk about their homeland, there is this deep and prevailing love they have for their hometown. I'm not sure. What about you guys in the UK? Do you have kind of the similar idea where it's, hometown is just kind of where you came from, like more the American perspective of it, or do you think it's maybe closer to the Japanese perspective, at least from what I've seen?
Yeah, I'd probably say it is more reminiscent of the Japanese perspective, because take Manchester, where I'm from, for example, there is a massive sense of pride about that Manchester identity. We've got like two world famous football/soccer teams that have, been in various different formats across like popular culture. There's the music scene that came out of here in the 90s, like Manchester, like Oasis, the Stone Roses. People get really tied down by that sense of connection to the city. But then you've also got like down south, Londoners are very proud of where they're from too. And you get the countryside as well. So I think particularly in the UK, you do get that sense of being rooted down to a place, but you also do get that adventurous spirit as well, where you can travel still like know where you come from ultimately at the end of the day.
Yeah, yeah. Any other things that you really wanted that really kind of stuck out to you in this movie that you wanted to particularly mention?
I think ultimately I just like how it ends with that prevailing idea of, rationality is always the way to go, I think, because it very much is about like order versus chaos.
Mhm.
Matsunaga is that chaotic aspect of the film, whereas Sonada represents order. But I don't think it's very black and white, I think it's usually people get hung up on that idea of there must be order, there must be chaos, but I don't think Kurosawa really wanted to talk about that at the end of the day. I think he was much more interested in showing that shades of grey aspect where
Mhm.
the order and the chaos does get mixed up more often than not, really. And it is up to you, the viewer, to take away where you stand on it. But I think the line that cuts through it is having that rational perspective, and that is where Sonada really ends the film. It's saying that, rationality will always win the day in the end. And I think,
Mhm.
rational is the way that Kurosawa really wanted people to go away thinking about with this film.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that you see that theme coming up again and again in his movies, this idea that there's not quite order or chaos, and if you kind of lean too far into one or the other, you kind of you're you miss a lot. I mean, you think about, like Yojimbo, Sanjuro in that movie. He's this kind of chaotic figure, but there is but he brings order to this town at the same time. Um, and you see like he doesn't really fit in with the samurai mold, but he doesn't fit in completely with like the Ronin, mercenary type role either, right? He's still a very humanistic character. Um, and or in the case of Ikiru, the other movie with Shimoda, where he plays a similar type part where he's this, button down law and order guy, but he ends up, basically kind of bucking the system and like, tricking his way into getting something done, which is a very chaotic thing to do in Japanese society, especially if you're a civil servant. So yeah, I think you're right. I think there's definitely something to that. Also, the fact that we've got the contrast to Sonata with the far more successful Dr. Takahama, right? Who's driving around these really nice cars. He's being chauffeured around even. He's obviously doing very well for himself. Whereas um, Sonata, who doesn't seem like he's an incompetent doctor. He seems like he's pretty good at what he does. And obviously he's got this alcohol problem and obviously he's rough around the edges, but you kind of get the sense that he could be as successful as Takahama, but he kind of understands that his place is here in the slums.
Yeah, and then that does go back to, Japanese societal constructs as well. But a lot of Kurosawa's characters just do not seem to fit those traditional molds. And again, I think there is that pervading sense of hope that even in this very like restrictive Japanese culture, you can still like strive to be more than you are, and there is more to
Mhm.
a single person than just what a society would put onto them necessarily.
Well, yeah, and well, like also in that also made me think of Seven Samurai with the love story with the farm girl and the samurai, and that's a pretty good example of when you kind of skew too closely to like these roles that society has deemed are appropriate for you, you end up unhappy. You end up broken basically in the end.
Hmm. And well, again, I think just before we end this, I do want to draw attention to Kurosawa's own journey as well, because I think it is easy to lose sight of the fact that, the 1940s to the 50s was really his golden decade where he was knocking out
Mhm.
hit after hit, but then you had like his middle career where everything just fell apart for him. He found himself like ousted from the industry, like really in debt, all the things that were going on, and then his perspective in how he filmed things like really changed, and there was much more of a sense of bleakness, I think, in his middle career. But then you get to the stage of when like Ran came out and he was going back through like his the comeback king essentially, and then I
Mhm.
think that's like what he put out there in his cinema as well, and you can track like where he came from with those really hopeful days of Drunken Angel and Rashomon, and then go all the way to when he is this elder statesman where he's coming out with these final like big hitters, and he's got like the respect of the Western and the Japanese industry. I think that is just
Mhm.
very reflective of a lot of the characters that he put out there in the Kurosawa verse, shall I say.
Mhm. Yeah, and also, and during that too, when he had tried to make the jump to Hollywood, even too, when he had felt like he was being disrespected in Japan, and he was supposed to be directing the Japanese scenes in Tora Tora Tora, but it didn't work out at all. Right. The budget was cut. He had the American crew had difficulty working with him. They had difficulty with his style. And and then he obviously too his suicide attempt as well, and unable to get fun, and when he had to basically Kagemusha had to have funding from Coppola and Lucas to get that movie made, because nobody really wanted to fund something that expensive from him.
Yeah, and but it's so fascinating, like how like George Lucas had this monster hit of Star Wars at the time, but then he meets like arguably one of his idols, and he just can't believe that this guy that has put out so many hits that he has found is like he can't believe that this is his hero, and he's struggling to
Hmm.
like get in for a story that he knows is going to like make like millions of dollars ultimately at the end of the day. But then he can obviously like parlay his Star Wars success into getting Kurosawa where he wants him to be. But I think that
Hmm.
is the connectivity of like these stories that even like a generation later they can still stand the test of time and still bring all of like these like powerhouses of this industry together throughout like the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s.
Hmm. Yeah. So there are your final things you wanted to say about Drunken Angel then before we close up?
Just watch it, that's ultimately what I'm going to say. I think it can sometimes be, easy to get wrapped up into some of Kurosawa's later work, but I think this is where Drunken Angel is going to be like the idea of when Kurosawa really starts to shine. If you're looking for like when Kurosawa can really start to get his style going, Drunken Angel is that for me. And I would highly encourage everybody to like really dive into it like that.
Yeah, yeah, it's a really interesting movie. Like it's obviously it's not as polished as some of the later stuff that people would be more familiar with, but you could definitely see the seeds of what would come in his later career, and I think that's kind of why he revisited these themes about like the doctor working for these people, or the man trying to help out the slums and all that. I think these themes keep coming back because maybe I mean, I almost hesitate to quote Woody Allen because of what a bastard he is, but he did say that. I mean, there is some truth to what he said when he said that I'm going to keep making the same film over and over again until I make it right. I think maybe Kurosawa kind of had that sense in him as well when he was going back to these themes with Ikiru and Redbeard.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and I can't remember like the Coppola line, but I think it's that idea of, I have not made an original film in my life, but I'm still going to go back because I know what works for me, and I'm going to just keep, why if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And
Mm,
arguably, I never really needed to, you know, deviate from his style because you could see the things that worked for him, what worked for audiences, and this is why we're still talking about his films today.
yeah, absolutely, yeah, and yeah, it is. It's a great insight into also a unique period in time, because you had this period when Japan was still under occupation, and this the movies that were being made in this period, they were very heavily censored. There wasn't a lot they could really do with them, but he's able to do quite a lot, and we do see some partnerships in this. Obviously, this wasn't the first time he worked with Shimura. Just looking over, he'd worked with Shimura at least oh, 3 times before, it looks like. Just kind of briefly glancing at the his filmography, but you do kind of see why he kept using Shimoda in this movie, and then why he also start kept using Mifune after this film as well.
Yeah, and I think again that's really interesting how he seemed to like fixate on like a very few like people that earned his trust and that he worked with repeatedly, but then he seemed to have this like pattern of like those relationships just imploding and things like needing to get back on track in a different perspective too. But that again, that is part of like Kurosawa's legacy and part of his legend, I would say as well.
And also, if you're not very familiar with Kurosawa's work and you're looking for something to kind of, if you're looking for a start point in too, I think this is a good film because, it is a very grounded movie, and it's also, a lot of his movies, they tend to be a bit on the longer side, but this one's, it's about like, under an hour and a half or so, I think. So it's not that long. So it's very easy to get a taste of what he can do. And then if you enjoy this, then you can go on to some of his longer works.
Yeah, it's a great taster, I think, because I think
Hmm.
like a usual Kurosawa running, I think it's usually like at least 2.5 hours, and this is like an hour and a
Hmm.
half. I think that is a great runtime just to like dip your toes into Kurosawa just to see what you think of it.
Absolutely. Okay, Jamie, well, thanks so much for coming on. And why don't you tell people where they can find you?
Yeah, like thanks for having me on. It's been really, really great conversation. Like I've really enjoyed like digging into like the nuances of this film and all the complexities that go along with it. You can find me at Yamato Magazine.blog, where you can learn more about my interest in Japanese culture through the history, food and drink. And as I mentioned previously, my book Japanese Fighting Heroes will be out in February 18th, and by the time this episode comes out, it'll be out as well. So thanks for having me.
Okay, great. And we will have links to that stuff in the show notes. So please make sure to check that up. And as for us, we are japanonfilm.com. You can go there and the website if you're interested in being a guest yourself. There's also information that you can find there. Japan on Film is us on the social networks, which is Instagram, Blue Sky, Threads. Those are pretty much the main ones. We are also part of the Film Stories Podcast Network, so please make sure to check them out at filmstories.co.uk and listen up after the credits to hear what's coming up next on the network. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. The Japan on Film podcast is produced by me, Perry Constantine, in conjunction with the Film Stories Podcast Network. Visit japanonfilm.com for show notes, episodes, and information about being a guest yourself. You can also reach out to me on the website's contact form if you have questions or comments about Japanese movies or the show itself. The show is at Japan on Film on Threads, Blue Sky, and Instagram, so please be sure to follow us. If you'd like to support the show, you can donate on japanonfilm.com, purchase from our advertisers, or leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Join the Film Stories Podcast Network Discord from the link in the show notes to connect with me and many other cinema fans and podcasters.
Britain. Fish and chips, cups of tea, the smell of the theatrical grease paint, the roar of the football crowd. A diverse nation grappling with its own long, complex history, always with one tongue firmly in cheek. Over the last century, British film has ebbed and flowed from Ealing comedy to carry-on sauciness, from the British New Wave to Cool Britannia, from Hammer Horror to Hammer Horror again. Forget Hollywood, embrace Pinewood. I'm AJ Black, author, writer and podcaster, and I love British film. Join me in a celebration of its quirks, its successes, its failures, and its unique gems at the Pictures in Britain. Please find and subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your podcast player of choice. Find the podcast on Linktree, linktr.ee/at the Pictures in Britain. And check out the Film Stories Podcast Network at www.filmstories.co.uk. See you at the Pictures.